Good evening. Welcome to this event of the Foundation for Science and Technology. My name is David Willetts. I'm the chair of this event. We're meeting both physically here in the Royal Society, but also with an online audience who are also very welcome. And I will be taking questions and interventions from the online participants as well as the people physically here in the room. We're at the Foundation are very grateful to the Government Office for Science for supporting this event and helping us identify the significance of COP27, and also the Physiological Society are also supporting the event this evening. And it's very well timed because next month in Egypt, we have COP27, a year on, of course, from COP26 in Glasgow. And for us in the Foundation for Science and Technology, we're very focused on the significance of science and its contribution to decarbonization, both of course, the physical sciences, but also ultimately we're talking about human behavior here. So the social sciences as well. And we know how important COP27 is, so that we're very delighted that we have as one of our speakers, Professor Mahmoud Sakr from Egypt, who I'll be introducing in a moment. We have 4 excellent speakers, and we will hear from them after the individual speakers have spoken and returned to their seats. We'll then, of course, have a panel discussion up here. If you're following on Zoom, do use the Q&A function, not the chat function, and do feel free to start putting down your questions as you listen to the presentations, and then upvoting. Upvoting really helps identify the questions that people attach most significance to. So without more ado, let me first introduce our first speaker, Sir Patrick Vallance, who holds the roles of Government Chief Scientific Advisor, National Technology Advisor, and Head of the Government Science and Engineering profession. He has combined in his career both academic research at UCL, commercial application through his role at GSK, and of course has played a crucial role in British science policy for many years now. Patrick, thank you very much for coming along to speak to us.
Thanks, David, and it's a great pleasure to be here. And again, let me also extend my thanks to Mahmoud Sakr for coming to this meeting. You know, the last 2.5 years or so have had governments around the world struggling with a pandemic. The big thing that's going to occupy governments for the next 20, 30, 40 years is, of course, climate and the response to that. And therefore, having a very strong science base to this is going to be critical. Oops, I've changed the slide without meaning to. Is going to be incredibly important for ensuring that there is policy which is evidence-based. And if we think about it, science identified the problem. Science is clearly crucial for tracking where we are, and it's going to be crucial for solutions as well. There are many experts here who are going to talk more about that than I can, but I wanted to reflect a little bit on COP26 and think about what the implications are for COP27 and going forward. The first thing is, and this may come as a surprise to you, it was the first ever COP with a day dedicated to science. Sort of surprising, actually. And it was the first time that in a COP meeting, it was decided actually having a chief scientific advisor would be quite helpful just to make sure the science got into the right place. The Science Day turned out to be unbelievably well attended. I think it was actually the most attended day of the entire COP meeting. And there were many outcomes of COP26 which were important. I mean, a simple one in a way was the consensus amongst participants from different backgrounds, policy, science, other areas, that there's no doubt that the climate is indeed changing, and there's no doubt that human activities have contributed to that change. And of course, the reason that was so possible to get to that place is because of the work of many scientists across the world and the IPCC. It was the first COP in which the text of the output, including a commitment to reduce reliance on fossil fuels. 23 countries agreed to phase out and not build new fossil fuel plants and not to invest in them. And that includes Indonesia, South Korea, Poland, Vietnam, and Chile. Mission innovation, the approach to try and get innovations that will make a difference to clean technologies and actually solving the problems, and the Glasgow breakthrough goals really press the notion of supporting innovation. Importantly, there was a clear link at the meeting between nature and climate and biodiversity. 130 countries agreed to halt and indeed reverse forest loss and land degradation by 2030. It wasn't just a meeting about mitigation, it also focused on adaptation. And the Adaptation Research Alliance was born at the meeting with 100 organizations over 35 nations. And where science advisors from countries, and I think in the end we ended up with something like 46 different countries, science advisors coming together to produce a letter to leaders, a short letter, indicating what we thought the key issues were that leaders needed to concentrate on. And I think that, again, is something that hopefully will go forward in future COP meetings in order to keep the science very present and very focused in a way that leaders can build on it. So there were some good outcomes of COP26, but there's a big but. And the big but is the scale of the challenge is extraordinary, whether that's in mitigation or adaptation. And the scale of the challenge is, of course, influenced by many external factors, including at the moment, a war in Ukraine, which is influencing all sorts of aspects of how one thinks about responding to this. So there's no doubt that this is a challenge which is going to occupy governments right way around the world. And it's not just that the challenge is big, but there are needs that we've still got to meet. There is still a need for more research. And the slide up here is from a recent paper in Science on tipping points. There are many tipping points potentially around the world: West Antarctic ice sheet, glacier destruction, sea level rises. We know that there are things going on which can have a big impact everywhere. We know that it's going to be beneficial to get better resolution modeling, to be able to understand what happens better over time and at much finer granularity of scale. So research and funding of research remains crucial. The second big challenge is indeed innovation. And whilst there are many things that you can see and touch and feel as innovation now, scaling from I can do it through to I can apply it to population level work across the country is a huge, huge technical, operational, scientific challenge. Big challenge around the green premium, as Bill Gates puts it. In other words, the cost of innovation being much more than the cost of not using innovation. That difference he calls the green premium, and getting that down in some way to a level in which this becomes practical for people is, again, a scientific, technical, engineering challenge. And there are specific areas that we still don't have adequate solutions to. Massive energy storage. How are we going to do that? Carbon capture, we know we're going to need to do that in any model, but we don't know yet exactly how we're going to achieve that at scale. Concrete, shipping, and of course, adaptation. What are the innovations that we need to adapt to what is inevitably going to be a changing situation? And the third area where we don't yet understand, I think, how this will drive things, and it's very difficult to understand, is behavior. And David has already mentioned behavior. Depending on things like how quickly we choose to take up electric vehicles, or how we change our own behaviors for what we eat, or how we fly, or how we choose to move around within countries. How we choose to adopt things and whether we can afford to adopt them is a massive part of defining how big ultimately the challenges we face. And so understanding, not to say what's the prescription to change behavior, because that is an incredibly difficult thing to do, but just to understand what are the things that are likely to produce a big swing factor on the scale of what it is that we need to tackle is going to be an important part of the next few years. So my final point is we've had lots of aspiration. We've had lots of very good statements about ambition, but actually we need plans and we need delivery plans and we need to get on with doing it. And that's really difficult. And of course is very difficult politically as well for people to buy into. But if you work back, if I just take the example of innovation, you work back from 2050, sounds like quite a long way off. But the scaling challenge means you bring it back and you realize if you can't actually begin to at least see part of the innovation today, you're probably not going to have it at scale in 2050. Doesn't mean you shouldn't keep researching to find more, but we need to get on with actually using some of the things we've got and getting them up to scale. And that means that this decade, in fact, these next 5 years is really, really important in terms of innovation coming to implementation and to scale. We need to do that, detailed plans. And this is a science and engineering point. I mean, a lot of this is engineering. How do you get to the plan for a roadmap to deliver against this? We need both push and pull mechanisms, financial and others, to make sure that innovation can come through. And this is where science again becomes really important. We need to be able to monitor the progress against this. And we need to think of this as a systems problem. What we tend to want to do is pick off each bit and say, I can solve electric vehicles, I can solve housing, insulation or whatever. But the whole thing actually has to go together, and land use is a critical example of where if you don't look at this through a system, you end up making a decision which has all sorts of unintended consequences. So systems monitoring, including, of course, understanding supply chains, which are going to be critical. And we need to continue to research new areas because it doesn't stop in 2050. The problem continues, and we need to make sure we've got the right answers for what comes next. So I'm very pleased, actually, that we've got somebody of the caliber of Mahmoud Sakr leading the science on COP27, because COP27 needs to be a very scientific meeting as we enter this next phase. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Patrick, for that excellent scene setter, identifying the key issues. And now we move to Professor Mahmoud Sakr, who I think of kind of as the Egyptian equivalent of Patrick. He is president of the Academy of Scientific Research and Technology in Egypt, a post he has held since 2014. He was co-founding director of the Center of Scientific Excellence for Advanced Sciences at the National Research Center in Egypt. He has authored more than 120 scientific publications. And with your crucial role in COP27, we're delighted that you have spared the time to come and be here with us this evening. Over to you.
First of all, thank you very much for the so kind invitation by the Foundation of Science and Technology to be here today and to give you an overview about the current situation of preparation for COP27. In fact, I'm not going to speak too much about our vision for COP process because it's international vision. So I will be a little bit focusing on the opinion of Egypt as a part of international science community. So, but the opinion of international science community for COP process and COP27, COP28, and so on, it's due to all of us as international science community. In fact, and on behalf of the Egyptian Science, Technology, Innovation community, I must thank Sir Patrick for his effort and for UK for their effort actually to put science in the heart and in the center of COP26. And this is the first time for me, to be honest, to listen about the role of science in COP process. So they did an extraordinary effort to shed the light on the importance of science on COP process and in climate change crisis as well. And of course, this is actually make our job very, very difficult. There's a big difference actually between COP26 and COP27 from different opinion. First of all, COP27 is an African edition of COP. So somebody has to expect that the opinion and the expectation of the African leader, African people and the community from COP is quite different. In COP26, we paved the way for science, and we succeeded actually to make the voice of science very loudly in COP26. But now the people in my continent actually are looking for the implementation. They would like to see something tangible in the floor. When I was assigned to take care of the coordination, I'm not the chief scientific advisor of COP27. This is not the case. This is not the system in our country, but I'm coordinating the activity of Science Day in COP27 in my capacity as the president of the Egyptian Academy of Science. And by the way, the Egyptian Academy of Scientific Research and Technology is a governmental organization. So I am assigned president, not elected one. So sorry. This is something completely okay. Come back to COP and the COP process. There are, as I mentioned, there are so many differences between COP26 and COP27, although the objectives are the same. All of us are working to confront the impact of climate change on our globe, either using mitigation, adaptation, and by the way, they are two important pillars. We cannot actually focus on one issues and neglect the other. The second difference between the two editions of COP is very limited time available, or was actually available for COP27, because Egypt as a government was notified by COP27 in a very late time. It's almost the same time when the United Arab Emirates has been notified to host COP28. So the time slots for the preparation for COP27 is quite short. But we are very lucky because actually we received a lot of support from Royal Scientific Society and a few UK university networks. Actually, they helped us too much. And we, of course, build on the successful track record of COP26. I will review with you very shortly some of the slides actually which reflect the current situation and the preparation for COP27. Our African people's leaders believe too much in implementation. They would like to see, as I mentioned, something on the floor. And our opinion very shortly to COP27 is to pave the way for the implementation, is to shed the light on the role of science on overcoming the barrier of implementations. The people believe that there are so many applicable and visible solutions to many of the climate change crises. The innovation, the research, the know-how are there. And I will speak about some sectors, for instance, like agriculture sectors, for instance. It's very easy, actually, using the available technology, know-how, innovation, actually, to reduce carbon dioxide emission from agriculture sectors using very simple technology, such as transformation of agriculture machines from diesel powered machine to PV powered one, for instance, to minimize the use of agrochemicals and replacing it with some organic. And there are so many solutions, but the problem is actually, of course, related to fund needed for scaling up and for mass application of the available and existing technology. This is one issue. We cannot actually neglect financial issues, but in addition to the financial issues, there are so many other challenges, including, for instance, the mindset transformation of the people, local communities, small farmers in Africa, in developing and less developing countries, why they must change from the practice, which is well-rooted, the tradition, and so on, to new emerging technology from their point of view. So it's not an easy task, as I mentioned. I will review with you some slides. So, of course, this is from the website of COP27. It's an addition with African task. So we believe too much in Africa that where there is a will, there is a way. Okay, I'm not going to speak about climate change, of course, but Egypt has a plan for sustainable development. And I believe one of the most, let us say, positive impact of Egypt STI community is trying to link between the National Development Plan and the Climate Research Plan. And this is actually can be easily reflected from these slides. So we put the Sustainable Development Goals and Egypt strategic objectives for sustainable development 2030, and try to do something for climate change research in Egypt. Egypt also has a strategy for national climate change. One of the specific objectives of Egypt's strategy for climate change is to enhance scientific research, technology transfer, knowledge, and public awareness for combating climate change. The most important issue for a long time, we are speaking about the gap between academia and industry. And usually in at least a developing country, we believe too much that bridging the gap will actually have a positive impact on technology transfer, commercialization, and return of investment from scientific research. But when it comes to climate change issues, I believe that bridging the gap between academia and policymaker is the most important issue, because most of the policymakers in developing countries do not believe actually in a serious action toward climate change or nature conservation issues. And somebody has to actually expect, because there are some sort of justification for that opinion, I believe. Fortunately, in Egypt, our president, Abdel Fattah el-Sisi, believed too much in climate change issues and is committed actually toward the climate change activities. And this can be easily recognized from Egypt hosting of biodiversity conference for a relatively very long period and submission of a proposal to host COP27, in addition to some mega project implemented nowadays by the government of Egypt to voluntarily lower carbon dioxide emission. I'm speaking about, for instance, a mega project in the field of renewable energy, establishing one of the largest PV electricity power in the world, based in south of Egypt in Pimpan. It produces its capacity up to 1,700 megawatt. It's one of 4 largest stations in the world. It is mega project and the transformation of Egyptian transportation system from fossil powered system to electric public transportation system, investment and re-innovation and building a new resilient and smart cities, reclamation of desert land, huge project in water treatment, recycling, and efficient use of water. This is so many political commitment, and this is actually an advantage for the science, technology, and innovation community in Egypt. So also one of the advantage, or let us say the strength of climate change research in Arab states is actually the research outcomes in the field of climate change research. And according to this report prepared by the Academy, actually Egypt and Saudi Arabia produces the highest number of international publications related to climate change research. It means that the local and regional science technology innovation community in Egypt and Arab states in Africa are quite aware with the problem and directed a relatively large portion of their fund and research towards climate change research. And this is actually paves the way for a good rule for science, technology, and innovation in combating climate change. Actually, our action plan for climate change is to redirect a part of public fund toward green fund, especially to post and to create enabling environment for green research in Egypt, is to work too much on the education and the mindset transformation awareness, because this is a big challenges in Egypt and other developing countries, innovation for climate and so on. As a result of this collaboration, I must thank very much the Royal Scientific Society and UK Universities Network. We prepared to gather some policy paper related to addressing climate change impact on health and achieving food security under climate change. This is part of awareness and raising the awareness, so many activities and so on in Egypt and Africa and Arab states related to climate change. Here, I started with my colleague at the Academy of Scientific Research and Technology because the Egyptian presidents for COP27 believe too much in implementation. So the challenge is how to showcase of some applied project which could help and support country efforts in achieving sustainable development under climate changes. This is the issue. So we are directing our effort towards implementation. So I will show you some of the applied project just to convince the people, the policymakers, the community, NGOs, and private sector that it's worth to invest in climate change confrontation, and at the same time also you can achieve some sort of sustainable development. It's not an easy task at all. To share knowledge and experience. So we showed to our government that it's important to invest in a national breeding program to develop crop variety more tolerant to adverse environmental conditions through mobilization of resources, working with GenBank, with breeders, international breeder, and so on. And we succeeded to develop, in collaboration with International Rice Research Institute in Philippines, a new rice variety with low water demand, for instance. This is something actually was received with too much respect from the policymakers in Egypt. So, and this is encouraged them to invest more in climate change research. Similarly, sample technologies can be used to produce, for instance, some new plant varieties more tolerant to adverse environmental conditions. Investment in the field of renewable energy, it wasn't an easy task at all. We started long time ago in 2015, 2016, and 17 to pave the way for the investment of the field of renewable energy through technology transfer, localization, and international cooperation. And as a result of this cooperation, we succeeded through generous research grant from EU to establish the biggest central core facilities for research and development in the field of renewable energy in Egypt, to serve not only Egypt, to serve Africa, because again, there are so many challenges also affecting the visibility of renewable energy project in Middle East and in Africa as well, as a result of very high temperature, dusty weathers, and so on. So the efficiency of most of the plant and the station decreases very rapidly. So you have to have for a new type of innovation tailored mainly for the different geographical zones of the world. So although climate change is a global issues and the concern and the crisis, but actually competing the climate change actually also need a global effort, but there is no one size fit all. Sorry, my English is not so good to find the proper expression. What I mean, there is no one solution can fit with different geographical zones of the world because it depends on actually the technology readiness level of the country or technology readiness level of the country. It depends on the finance, it depends on the education, it depends on the culture, it depends on the religion, it depends on everything. So it's a very complicated system. So we are trying to use the available and accessible international technology and innovation to tailored a local solution for a global challenges. In the field of renewable energy, again, we started actually to find a new innovative way to convince people that investment in biodiversity and nature conservation could be a wealthy and could generate revenue as well. So we started to focus on plant genetic resources in Egypt and to highlight about some economic importance of wild plant and landscaping industry, for instance, as an alternative fooder and so on. Similarly, we used the indigenous knowledge actually in collaboration with National Biodiversity Record to show the people that some indigenous knowledge can be used and transferred to a business for the sustainability of community. One of the most important issues we usually trying to link between the climate change research, science, and the tradition and the cultural heritage and so on to receive some sort of public acceptance and marketing as well. And this is the Egyptian Genome Project. And by the way, I'm very happy that the Egyptian Genome Project, it looks quite far from climate change, but it is in the core of the climate change. And I can explain later on in the discussion. But we tried to convince the policymaker to support a basic research project with billions of Egyptian pounds in the field of genomic research to link it to the ancient Egyptian genome, because the people and the tourists believe too much in ancient Egyptians and so on. So we try to actually make some sort of link between recent Egyptian and ancient Egyptian genome. And by the way, I'm very happy that the work actually of 70 people who won Nobel Prizes a year and in his genetic studies on Neanderthal, it's quite similar to the research we are carrying on at the Academy of Scientific Research and Technology. And 7 years ago, we published for the first time the successful recovery of DNA and genome sequence of ancient Egyptian genome. And this work was published and it was related to the DNA fingerprint of Tutankhamun. It's something, but unfortunately at that time, the people and the international media covered this good achievement in the field of science from the touristic point of view, because they ignored very well the technology used to develop this DNA fingerprint and to extract and purify DNA at the expense of this very famous young king who died at 17 years old and so on. Yeah, it's something. So our plan for COP27, as I mentioned to my colleagues in the Royal Scientific Society just a half hour before this meeting, we now have 3 big events in the Blue Zone and COP27. One is Redirect. Redirect, as you see, is acronyms, initials of the rule of research development and innovation in addressing climate change, technology transfer, and knowledge sharing. Redirect simply means that redirection of some of the public fund resources toward climate change research. Redirect means networking and use the existing bridges for cooperation among international scientists to tackle climate change. This is one of the subjects. The second event is related to WIPO Green Technology Report, or POC, and this event actually was drafted by WIPO and the Academy of Scientific Research and Technology. And the main objectives here is to have WIPO on board because it's actually the catalyst of the emerging technology and the leader of new technology in the world. And actually, they provided us with a lot of information about green IPR, isn't in public domain or still in protection phase, and how the green patent and the green innovation can help country efforts in confrontation of climate change. The third event, which is really very important, and this is actually reflect the Egyptian opinion and vision for COP27, redesigning strategy in a changing world. We believe too much that there are available solution, technological solution, innovative solution, and so on. But we believe also that not only innovative and technological solution can really achieve some sort of sustainable development under climate changes without collaboration, because the available slots for us in the blue zone in Science Day is very limited. So we, on behalf of international science community, booked a zone area in the green zones to be a window for international science stakeholders and people interested actually to share and to contribute and to participate in COP27 to make their activities through this area. And I will stop here. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much indeed. And it's good to hear of the African focus, very understandable for COP27, and the challenge of implementation, which I have to say is a challenge we face in the UK as well, actually getting on with it. And our next speaker wrestles with that challenge, both in her previous job as chair of the Environment Agency, and now Emma Howard-Boyd is chair of the Green Finance Institute. She has important roles as UN Global Ambassador for Race to Zero and Race to Resilience. She was also the UK Commissioner to the Global Commission on Adaptation from 2018 till 2021. So Emma, over to you.
Thank you, David, for that kind introduction. And before I go into the details of my speech, I did want to say a huge thank you, having heard both from Sir Patrick and Professor Mahmoud, to all the civil and public servants, both in the UK government, but I'm sure in the Egyptian government, who've been beavering away on the COP26 agenda and now the COP27 agenda, and it's really important and vital work. So a big thank you to any of you who are in the room or indeed online. It's always a pleasure to speak here at the Royal Society. As we walk around this building, it's impossible not to be reminded that we're standing on the shoulders of giants. But we also know that the severe weather brought to us by a changing climate threatens to throw us off. So as well as racing to net zero, we must become more resilient and learn to adapt to the future that scientists and climate activists have long warned us about, and which has quite frankly been a reality for some of the most climate vulnerable countries for decades. This future is now a reality for many millions, and it is a reality for all of us here today. We're living in a time of huge uncertainty and change at a local, national, and global level. I gave my final public speech as chair of the Environment Agency on July the 12th. We were mid-heat wave and at the start of the Conservative leadership context. Little did we know what was coming our way. On July 22nd, we hit a milestone in the UK's climate history when temperatures of 40 degrees were recorded for the first time. More than 2,800 excess deaths were noted. Since then, a third of Pakistan has been flooded. California has been pushed close to blackouts by a heat wave. Europe has suffered spectacular wildfires. The Yangtze River in China has dried up. million people were told to evacuate as super typhoon Nanmadol hit Japan. Hurricane Fiona wreaked havoc throughout the Caribbean to Canada, followed swiftly by Hurricane Ian, battering the east coast of the US. And more than 600 people have died and 1.3 million have been displaced from their homes in flooding that has hit 33 of Nigeria's 36 states and the capital. I sense I'm only skimming the surface of the climate shocks threatening lives and livelihoods around the world. The V20 group of finance ministers from 58 climate vulnerable economies reckon 20 years of climate impacts have cost their countries $525 billion. Developing countries face a 2030 bill ranging from either 290 billion to $580 billion, according to a 2019 study. And African nations are losing 5 to 15% of GDP annually due to impacts, says the Africa Development Bank. Leading insurer Aon reckons global economic losses from natural disasters in 2022 already total $227 billion, warning that the swathe of impacts in 2022 are in line with the global trend and support conclusions from the last IPCC assessment report. The science could not be clearer. 40% of the world's population is highly vulnerable to climate change. This is no longer a distant threat, but happening now. Conflicts around fossil fuels in many parts of the world are demonstrating the necessity to scale up and accelerate rather than derail a just transition towards cheaper, more accessible, more secure, zero carbon energy. 2022 also represents a turning point for the food and agricultural agenda and our relationship with nature. Surging food prices are of particular concern to Africa, Asia, and the Middle East that depend heavily on wheat imports. In a dangerously divided world, we need to invest now to prevent the worst of the climate and nature crisis and avoid further horrendous costs of inaction. So as we head to COP27, where do we look for reasons to be cheerful? I'm going to focus on 3 areas: net zero commitments, green finance opportunities, and investing in adaptation and resilience. Net zero targets now cover over 90% of the global economy, yet fewer than 1/5 of net zero targets set by national and subnational governments, and only 1/3 of the largest public corporates with net zero targets actually meet science-aligned criteria, according to the Net Zero Tracker. The breakthrough agenda was designed to strengthen international collaboration where it is most needed. At COP26, leaders of 44 countries plus the European Union, representing over 70% of global GDP, committed to work together to make clean technologies and sustainable solutions the most affordable, accessible, and attractive option in high-emitting sectors before the end of this decade. The first phase of work focuses on 5 sectors, which today account for over 50% of current emissions: power, hydrogen, road transport, steel, and agriculture. In each of the sectors, we see growing investment in solutions, but as world emissions continue to rise, progress is not yet fast enough to meet the goals that were agreed under the breakthrough agenda. Regarding corporate commitments, the UN Secretary General's high-level expert group on net zero will deliver its first set of recommendations to tackle poor corporate net zero targets during the first week of COP27. Chaired by ex-Canadian Minister for the Environment, Catherine McKenna, the group was mandated at COP26 to tackle the lack of accountability for corporate targets. Alongside these corporate commitments, there are massive green finance opportunities. And one way to think about green finance that might be helpful to this group in particular is to see it as the direct application of science to financial decision-making. And I think this is critically important perspective for both the green finance and scientific communities to be emphasizing right now. Why? Because investing and lending in line with scientific consensus on climate change and the depletion of our natural resources is increasingly under attack from those who want to portray it as an indulgence that was tolerable when the basic metrics of corporate returns were supported by low levels of inflation, low corporate tax rates, historically low interest rates, and the high leverage, high margins, and high valuations that resulted. But now, as those fundamentals are changing and markets are correcting, let's get back to the day job of delivering high risk adjusted returns instead of focusing on environmental, social, and governance matters is becoming a viewpoint that those with considerable influence are increasingly comfortable voicing in public. There may be over 450 financial institutions signed up to net zero goals by 2050, but money only moves if it can make money. And there is a lot of money to be made from financing new and expanding fossil fuel prospects. The top global banks lent $3.8 trillion towards just that between the Paris and the Glasgow climate conferences. We need far greater and more urgent focus on primary capital deployment. The net zero transition is a highly capital intensive business, and to date we've focused a lot of energy on secondary market considerations, such as aligning equity portfolios with various metrics, which can only indirectly impact the availability and cost of capital for investments in new technologies and new projects. We now need equal vigor on deploying bank lending, bond issuance, initial public equity offerings, private equity, venture capital, real asset investments towards real economy direct investment. And in practice, that's going to mean radical collaboration between all aspects of the financial ecosystem, far more emphasis on public capital, including the balance sheets of the multilateral banks and development finance institutions, as well as philanthropic capital being used to lower the risk for commercial mainstream capital to redeploy its money towards sustainable opportunities. A more effective use of limited public money may be to shift from grants to guarantees, crowding in private sector finance. We also know that investing in adaptation and resilience works. To give an example close to home and to my heart, last year, the Environment Agency completed the government's £2.6 billion 6-year capital flood programme on time and on budget. It means 700 flood schemes are better protecting more than 300,000 homes, nearly 600,000 acres of agricultural land, thousands of businesses, and major pieces of infrastructure. The government has upped the budget of the new programme to a record £5.2 billion. And with a significant UK national infrastructure and construction pipeline out to 2030, it will be important that this infrastructure is built ready for the climate events that we know are locked in. I also believe the future lies in some form of adaptation standards, and this is relevant to the whole world, not just the UK. More work is needed to develop a strategic approach to managing climate risks. Presently, we do not know what the optimum level of investment is for the UK climate adaptation, or how this should be balanced between the public and private sectors. So I hope the UK government and other governments will consider asking the Treasury or the Ministry of Finance to commission reviews of the economics of resilience. This would consider the costs and benefits of resilient measures and the balance between public and private investments. Its conclusions would help establish a national ambition for climate resilience, embed it in all government departments, and enable us to reach net zero. After all, if construction does not properly consider rising floods and extreme heat, low carbon infrastructure could become prematurely obsolete. Initiatives such as the Coalition for Climate Resilient Investment are doing some much needed work in this space. Developed to address the massive gap in financing resilience, the Physical Climate Risk Assessment Methodology, PCRAM, published last month, is a global practitioner's guide that supplies the practical tools to identify and assess the resilience of infrastructure assets. The methodology facilitates a profound shift in the resilience narrative, by which resilience becomes a core component of innovative strategic decision-making. A rigorous integration of these risks should allow the unlocking of the upside, enabling countries and investors to become more competitive, attractive, and strategic instead of being penalized for acknowledging their exposure. And we're delighted to be working with the Egyptian government through the coalition. So to conclude, I am certain that if we can align all the work that we've heard about this evening and adapt the systems that underpin it, this decade will not just be the decade we pull the world back from the precipice of climate and nature catastrophe. It will be the decade we unlocked a just, resilient, and sustainable path to prosperity for billions of people around the world. And finally, I was struck by these words from a book that is about to be published. Right now, we are in desperate need of hope, but hope is not about pretending that everything will be fine. To me, the author, hope is not something that is given to you. It is something you have to earn, to create. It cannot be gained passively through standing by and waiting for someone else to do something. Hope is taking action. It's stepping outside your comfort zone. The clue of the author is in the next sentence. And if a bunch of weird school kids were able to get millions of people to start changing their lives, just imagine what we could all do together if we really tried. It's Greta Thunberg and her climate book. My final sentence, hope isn't just a noun, it's a verb. We have to do hope. So let's get on to it. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Emma. And now we have our fourth final speaker, Professor Jim Skea, who is Professor of Sustainable Energy at Imperial College London. He, of course, has a track record of research interest in energy and climate change, and he is co-chair of the IPCC Working Group 3 for the 6th assessment cycle, and is currently the chair of Scotland's Just Transition Commission. We very much look forward to hearing from you. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you, David. And I think all of the presentations have been slightly different, and that will not change. So just to say, I'm going to do this very much through the lens of IPCC, but as none of the material whatsoever has been approved by IPCC, I've done this through Imperial College branding, which gives me a little bit more freedom. And I just want to say right at the beginning, I would echo the messages that other people have made, that science is absolutely crucial for COP27. And I hope what I'm going to present really illustrates how important it is. IPCC has regular meetings with the UNFCCC Secretariat through the subsidiary body for scientific and technological advice. And we had a meeting just yesterday where we were mapping out the way that science, and IPCC in particular, would interface with the negotiations during COP27. So once again, a pleasure. There is a Science Day on the 10th of November, Egypt, KU maintaining the tradition established in Glasgow, but also an Earth Information Day that's been put together by Substa as well on atmospheric observation and the contributions that it can make to climate action. Of the other kinds of events, I've divided them into two kinds that I've called science push and policy pull. This is my terminology, I should say. Science push meaning events that the scientists have come up with because they think they will be important. And the main route for that will be through an IPCC shared pavilion, which is branded Science for Climate Action to send a very clear signal about the intention. And then on the policy pool side, I'm referring to events that have been stimulated by the negotiations side, where they've actively asked for scientific input to help with the negotiations. And one important element of that will be the contribution to the first global stocktake and the technical dialogue that's taking place at the moment. I should say the IPCC pavilion, there was a little bit of a bloodbath and kinds of debating between IPCC, WMO and the Mary Foundation, how many slots we all got each. IPCC has ended up with 20 slots and altogether about 8 for Working Group 2 on impacts, 8 for Working Group 3 on mitigation, then 2 each for Working Group 1 and science and the inventories people, because they have already had a chance at COP26. So I'll go through it, and just to flag, I will divide it up according to the working groups. I come from the mitigation working group, and these are the sessions that we will be putting on in the IPCC pavilion. And they're all very juicy topics that we well understand to be of importance to policymakers. First 2, I will do a little bit of a deep dive into on scenarios and reconciling different estimates of greenhouse gas emissions. They both play into the negotiations. Now, I had the pleasure of presenting this slide, I think about 6 months ago, when I was presenting the Working Group 3 results at a Royal Society meeting. And I have to say, we scientists have done a great job about confusing policymakers in the way that we present scenarios to the world. IPCC does not have its own scenarios. It assesses scenarios that other people produce, and there are thousands of them out there. But it's our job to distill them and send clear messages to policymakers. And as you can see with the terminology that I have splashed all over this screen, we're not doing a very good job at it at the moment. To the extent that when we approved the Working Group 1 report, the policymakers cut through it and said we'll have very low, low, intermediate, high, and very high, thank you, to cut through all this mess of different terminology. So we are going to have a couple of sessions on scenarios through IPCC. One, we will simply present what we've done to try and help people to understand it. But in the second one, it will be much more an engagement session with policymakers, where we will ask them what they want us to do with scenarios, how to construct scenario architectures that are actually meaningful for people. And that will actually lead to an IPCC workshop that will take place in April next year, where we decide or make recommendations for the next assessment cycle. Now, my apologies for the next one on reconciling different greenhouse gas emission estimates. I'm not going to give an academic seminar on this, but what I want to flag is that there is a 5 gigaton difference between the emission estimates submitted by countries under the Framework Convention and the emission estimates used in global models. Now, 5 gigatons is 10% of global emissions, so this is troubling, and it's mainly related to carbon dioxide fluxes from land. And many developing countries that are on the verge of trying to produce net zero commitments are actually struggling to understand what net zero means because of that 5 gigaton difference. So we are going to have a session with policymakers to try and explain what the differences are, that's not, which can be quite complex, and present ways in which these emission estimates might be reconciled. And I won't go into the detail, but the main difference is distinguishing land into managed land and unmanaged land, and distinguishing between direct human intervention and indirect natural effects. And the inventories do it a different way from the global models. We understand the difference, but it is not an easy job to communicate it. And it does have a significance for the setting of net zero targets. I'll just flag up the other mitigation events that we will be having on the pavilion. And just to echo, I think, what David and Sir Patrick were saying, a lot of this is about the human side as well. A lot of this is around economics and social aspects. And I would particularly flag number 4 on the list, where IPCC for the first time in a report really dealt with lifestyle and behavioral issues and tried to get under the surface. And there's been a lot of interest in that. And I have to say, I was quite surprised that we managed to get some of this stuff through an approval session at the end of the day, because it's a little bit controversial, but I think it really moved the agenda forward. I should say, my pet subject, we're also having a session on managing just transitions, and the International Labour Organization is actually having a separate pavilion just devoted to just transition. Our colleagues in Working Group 2 are doing a set of events on impacts, adaptation and vulnerability. Their titles are still quite high level at the moment, but I'd flag up nature-based solutions, and then specific concerns about, for example, the situation of small islands. We also have a number of events where we've collaborated across the working groups, and just to say, the collaboration between working groups has been absolutely exceptional in the last cycle. We've really worked together. So one will be on the question of overshoot, because many of the projections for the 21st century envisage us warming up, say, to 1.6, 1.7 degrees, taking carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere and cooling down again. And the consequences of that for impacts, adaptation, and vulnerable systems is something that needs explored. We've always kind of assumed that temperature goes up like that, and dealing with the impacts when it reaches a peak and comes down again is something that needs much better understood. Some colleagues have produced an excellent set of summaries for urban policymakers, particularly on adaptation, mitigation, and science, which I have to say are probably more comprehensible than some of the summaries for policymakers, which we painfully negotiate with the governments as we finalise the report. And climate information for near-term preparedness and risk management will also be covered there. Now, on the mandated events, and this is the kind of thing that's actually coming from the negotiations side, on Earth Information Day, there will be a session on observations for adaptation and early warning systems, but also, interestingly, a session on Earth observations for mitigation. And that's to help with measuring the impact of mitigation measures and emission inventories by Earth observation, rather than simply using the activity indicator times an emission factor to arrive at an estimate of emissions. And our colleagues in the inventories part of IPCC have just had an expert meeting on that. And the government's also wanted a specific event on adaptation needs based on the Working Group 2 report. And there will also be a special event on the gender-related aspects of AR6, which will cover the, as it were, the substantive content of the working group reports, but will also look at the way that gender balance could be improved within the negotiation and the scientific processes as well. And finally, there will be a high-level ministerial roundtable on pre-2030 ambition. And as I'm supposed to speak on it, but I still don't know what I'm going to say because we don't have the organisation meeting until tomorrow morning, I'm afraid I can't tell you much about this one. But the clear indication there, we have an emissions gap in that the pledges we have at the moment will not take us to 1.5 degrees, but we also have an implementation gap because the policies on the ground will not allow the pledges to be met, and we need to address both of these issues. This is the last substantive slide. It's on the global stocktake. Just to remind you, under the Paris Agreement, there will be a global stocktake every 5 years. The first one is in 2023. And next year, there will be a political phase to the global stocktake. But in this year, there is a technical phase where there's a big demand for the output of IPCC and other science to input into the global stocktake process to provide evidence. We've already had a set of sessions at the subsidiary bodies meeting earlier in this year, and it will in COP27, we'll follow roughly the same pattern. There will be three kinds of ways in which it will happen, other than a beginning plenary and a closing plenary. There will be a set of round tables that broadly cover mitigation, adaptation, and means of implementation and support. These round tables were so busy in COP26 and at the subsidiary bodies meeting that people could not get into the room. They will now take place in the full plenary session and will go into breakout groups to discover more specific topics. And I noticed our colleagues in UNFCCC have managed to get the word transformation into the mitigation one, which is a major triumph because we struggled in IPCC for a long time to get the word transformation into agreed text. There will also be a couple of what they're calling focused exchanges on intersections, which will puzzle anybody. It also puzzles me as I will be making one of the presentations at it. And again, we need to get under the surface. But basically, it's to look at the things that cut across mitigation and adaptation and means of implementation, because there are many responses to climate change that have mitigation and adaptation outcomes, and we do need to explore that. And finally, boldly, the organisers have created a World Cafe session where people will move around about 20 tables at half-an-hour intervals to talk about specific topics. It worked really well back in June. I had the joy of facilitating a table on what became known as energy transitions, which attracted a huge amount of attention given the topic. But this is really a valuable way of getting insights from policymakers where they're not constrained by the formal nature of the negotiations to try to pull the insights through. So I'll finish it there, but I think the big conclusion is that negotiations are hungry for scientific advice, and there is strong evidence of that. And one quote that came out for yesterday's meeting with Substa, it wasn't about keeping 1.5 alive, it was also keeping the science alive. And I will stop there.
Good. Well, we've had four excellent presentations, and it really is bringing the prospect of COP27 to life. We're seeing the challenges that we face and getting a sense of the shape of the agenda for COP27 in a month's time now. So it's an opportunity for you to put questions, and I'm also, of course, collecting some from the Q&A function on Zoom. But let's start with people in the room, and I see two hands up towards the back there. Yes. And if you could give your name and organization, please, that'd be great. Oh, yes.
Line topics is going to be loss and damage. And I wondered what the panel had to say about the research questions around loss and damage. What are the things that we need to know around this, and who's doing the science?
Right, thank you. Let's collect a couple more. Yes, or someone else at the back there. All right, yes, let's go there. Right, in the middle there. Let's revise that sentiment. Right.
Don't quite think I'm at the back, but right. I'm Amy Booth. I am from the University of Oxford, and I'm from South Africa. So I echo your sentiments, Prof. Mahmoud. We are genuinely quite happy that COP is being held on the African continent. And I think one of the other things that we're hoping might come out of this is really a focus on climate financing and climate justice. Now, one of my concerns, and this comes on the basis of India's stance at COP26, is that they sort of said this is not our responsibility, and we have a lot of other issues to focus on. So do you think that that might also be a prominent voice in the African continent, that there are more pertinent issues that these countries should be focusing on, and that climate change isn't actually their responsibility to tackle? And on the basis of that as well, how optimistic are you that issues of climate justice and climate financing is going to be a tangible outcome of COP27?
Right. And I'm going to, let's carry on moving forward. I'm going to collect two more interventions. I see there's a lot of hands up. And we'll start with you, Professor Sakr, for your observations. Yeah.
Yes, Tim Palmer from Oxford. I guess as scientists, we're all unanimous that international collaboration is vital, and I guess Professor Mahmoud spoke about that. But I wonder if we need to, in view of the urgency, we need to take that a step further and ask ourselves the question of whether we should be creating new types of institutes where the countries of the world pool their human and financial resources on these targeted problems of things like energy, of adaptation, and certainly in my own field of climate modeling, to do things that we cannot do at the national level. And we can find examples in high energy physics and astronomy where that's manifestly worked. So is this an urgent priority for science and technology to tackle these urgent problems?
Very good. And then finally, I think down at the front here, there was a question. Yes.
Thank you. Andrew McKenzie from the Physiological Society, and we're particularly interested in the health implications of climate change. So my question is health high enough up the agenda, both broadly and particularly at COP27 when it comes to thinking about adaptation and mitigation? Are we prepared enough for the big health ramifications that are coming down the line quite quickly?
Professor Sakr, just don't feel obliged to answer all four of the questions, but any observations you have, we'd be very interested. So over to you.
Thank you very much. Yes, African people and African community have different perceptions from COP, especially as I mentioned, it's an African edition of COP process. The challenges actually of climate change on Africa and the African people is really chronic and quite different. So as an African person, I believe too much that now is the time for mobilization of resources. And now is the time actually for supporting African countries' needs and to confront climate changes. Many of African peoples believe they that are not responsible about the current crisis of climate change. They believe that they pay the bill of nothing. And as a scientist and as a representative of African continent, we believe that the flow of information, it's not only the finance, it's so many challenges related to actually supporting African effort to combat climate changes. Finance, of course, is in the top, but other challenges is related to access to information, to big data, to images, to Earth observation data as well, data analytic, real-time flow of information in two directions, and also related to capacity building of African continents. When I speak about capacity builds, I'm not speaking only about developing the capacities of human personnel, but developing the capacities also of the research institutions. For instance, we are now in their need for a very strong network for Earth observation in Africa, for instance. Sharing information is really very, very important. But to be honest, also, there are a lot of things actually African people and the government has to actually tackle seriously and to align themselves to the global actually efforts to combat climate change. Of course, we are focusing too much on adaptation and resilience, but to be honest, we cannot really tackle the climate change crisis with a serious efforts and action plan in adaptation and mitigation. Let's start by voluntary lowering of carbon dioxide emission in Africa. Let us actually think a new innovative solution applicable and visible and fit with African requirements. So this is related to the first question. Related to the second question, which is actually, I forgot.
Well, that was a question about climate financing and justice, which I think you've touched on.
Yeah.
And I think you may want to comment on the, especially with your background, the health impact issue that was referred to.
Yeah.
And we will move on to other interventions. Do you want to remark on that?
Yeah. Of course, we have actually some good lessons from the COVID-19 actually. And all the people now believe that global challenges need global efforts. So you cannot actually eliminate COVID-19 without actually eliminating the pathogen from all over the world. And the impact of climate change and health sectors in African countries has direct impacts and indirect impacts. Direct impacts, we are speaking about, of course, the well-known effects related to emergence of new infectious diseases, new vectors, and so on, both due to high temperature, issues related to malnutrition and so on. But Africa also suffer a lot, not only from the impact of emerging diseases and infectious diseases and the impact on health sector, but also the health sector system in Africa is quite fragile. And we are in their need actually to building capacity in this regard and to really help African people to put a national One Health plan, especially again, to be honest and to be very straightforward. We in Africa believe that some infectious diseases well rooted in Africa is not a top priority for the global for the world. There are some very clear examples, and again, there are so many literature belief about biased healthcare system and priorities when it comes to Ebola, for instance, to malaria. It's by the way, the people died in Africa from malaria is double the people died from COVID-19 and all over the world. So now is the time actually to speak very friendly and to actually try to convince the people in Africa that climate change is a global challenge, need global effort, and we are together in the same boat, developed and the developing country as well.
Thank you very much. Jim, do you want particularly to pick up on that question as to whether there is an institutional gap? Because you've seen close up how the current institutions function. Any observations on that?
Yeah, I mean, it appears that, you know, whether you're looking at physical climate modeling or some of the integrated assessment modeling, which is more on the economic and social side, the market, as it were, tends towards an oligopoly of about 5 or 6 major groups that participate in the process. And I don't think that's particularly harmful, actually, because I think the competition between the groups actually spurs people on to improve the models and improve what they're doing. The anxiety I would have about it at the moment is that the leading modeling teams come from a relatively small number of countries that don't reflect the whole picture. They're not representative of the globe. And for the integrated assessment modelings that I'm particularly familiar with, there's an incredible dominance from Europe, North America, and Japan in the modelling process. And it's okay if you invite Indians and Chinese people to participate, but actually the questions that are being asked by the models might be questions that take a very global north perspective. And that's a point that's been made very heavily by our Indian colleagues, you know, when we were approving, you know, the Working Group 3 reports. So yeah, I think there are institutional things that are done, but I don't think there's any problem in having competition between different modelling groups to spur the efforts on.
Thank you. Emma, do you want to focus particularly on the climate financing and climate justice? Because there was a commitment of $100 billion that was supposed to go as financing for developing countries to handle climate change, but we haven't got there, have we? How is progress?
We haven't got there, and what I'm picking up, but I'm not close enough really to know, is the signs aren't looking great. I think we need to look at some of the initiatives that are coming to the fore. So Germany with the Shield initiative that they just recently announced. I think Mia Motley's Bridgetown work as well, looking at reforming the global systems, IMF, World Bank. These areas are really coming to the fore and being discussed ever more widely, not just at COP, but at other relevant global meetings. I do think in terms of the science that could help some of the loss and damage and the climate finance debate, attribution analysis that some institutions are getting ever more focused on could help. It could also help from a litigation perspective as well. And I know there are some countries, some groups that are looking at litigation and using attribution analysis, whether this weather event was caused by man-made climate change. I think there was also a question on targeted collaboration, and a report came out recently, I think it was at New York Climate Week, on the breakthrough agenda. And the recommendations around the 5 sectors was that perhaps you needed one global institution to pull together all of the necessary collaboration to make those particular sectors work at pace. But as Patrick rightly pointed out, this has to be systemic change. You have to look at all of the players, and science has a massive role in that. Thank you.
And Patrick, your observations on any of those points?
Well, maybe I'll just pick up on the institution one. I think it's obviously important that there is global collaboration around this. And I think some of the mechanisms, funding mechanisms, actually stimulate that. So Mission Innovation, Adaptation Research Alliance, and so on, do try and do that. It's an interesting question about whether an institution would bring this together with more focus. And it seems to me that the question that we need to ask is, what would an institution actually do that you can't do in a distributed model? And I have a slight worry that there may be some specific areas where you say an institution would provide infrastructure and other things that would be important. But in others, just creating an institution, I think, can sometimes just lead to lots of money on buildings and structures rather than actually doing the research. So I think institutions are not the answer to lots of it. They might be the answer to a few very specific things where you need a significant infrastructure in order to do the work.
Thank you. Now, I'm going to get another round of questions from here, and I've got, but I should just record coming in on Zoom. There's a couple of questions, and I may, after we've collected other interventions, turn to Patrick in particular, which is really about the UK scene. We've got, following on from what Patrick has just said, one question is, do we believe that the institutional arrangements within and around government, and I think particularly UK government, for delivery of net zero are sufficient? And if not, what needs to be put in place? I think that you wrote with Nancy Rothwell about this, Patrick. So a question on that. And also, this is a quick response. Do we know what our new government's plans are for energy? And definitely, absolutely, it's all becoming very clear. So that's, and Patrick might want, I might tempt Patrick to speculate about that. So there's a couple of them that come in online. And by the way, I can also assure our people participating online, this recording is going to be shared and will be up on our FST website tomorrow morning. But let's also collect some questions from around the room. Yes, here we are. And then we'll go over there. Yep, starting there. Yeah, and then Gavin back, then where there's 2 on the, that's right. Yep.
Thank you. My name is Lorenzo Fioramonti. I'm the new director of the Institute for Sustainability at the University of Surrey. The question is, there is a policy that comes at no cost, but that we believe may have a major impact. And that is to teach sustainability and climate change in all schools around the world. It goes back to what was said earlier about the role of the youth. One of the things the youth want is to be able to be empowered when it comes to dealing with climate change. In my previous life, I was Italy's Minister of Education, and we were the first country in the world to make it mandatory in all schools and universities to study sustainability and to learn about the green civics, what you do, how do you build community awareness around that, and how can you build new labs and new activities to make a difference. Would you agree that perhaps COP in Egypt should make a global call to have sustainability and climate change embedded in all school curricula around the world?
Very good. Thank you for that challenge. And I think there were 2 questions there, Gavin. Yeah.
Okay, Fawzia Rashid from the Aga Khan Health Services, and I'm the climate and environment lead for 8 countries operations. And the perspective of this question to the panel is because we've set ourselves a net zero ambition by 2030, and we're doing quite well. But in terms of, I think it was Dr. Mahmoud Sakr mentioned this gap between what we know and what we're doing. We really need to see tangible results. I think, Patrick, you were talking in the same vein. And the finance has come in too, in terms of IP, green growth, etc. So where we have made a big difference is by identifying the sweet spot that makes money. And there is a sweet spot that makes money on the mitigation agenda. And that covers, in our case, 60% of the journey in terms of decarbonization. It took us a long time to learn this, but I really wonder, instead of institutions, is there not something that we can do to accelerate spotlighting what makes money and what will make an impact, and really showcase that? It took us too long to come to our realization. We're now very successfully sharing it, but there are many other, surely, endeavors that would make a difference on mitigation as well as adaptation.
Would you like very briefly to give us an example of the kind of thing that does make money that you are supporting?
Sure. So basically, in terms of, standard things, including insulation, solar, all the energy efficiency measures, low-cost measures to reduce what you buy, use and throw away and recycle more and so on. All of that, including standard good management practices of, efficient use of transport, all save money. And in our case, the payback time is, when we calculated it in March this year, to get 60% down from where we are, and we have very good data, I should say. The payback time was 5.7 years. Now with the energy prices increasing more, I think we're really closer to 5, if not below.
Very interesting, thank you. And then there was another question, I think, behind you, yes?
Yes, I'm Damon Silvers. I'm with UCL's Institute for Innovation and Public Policy. I think there are some assumptions in this conversation that I wanted to challenge, and I want to just run through 4 of them for you briefly. The first is there's an assumption in this conversation that mitigation is possible. And I think that the IPCC projections, I know I'm not using the right technical word, the IPCC projections show we are on a path to 3 degrees and global civilization can't handle it. That's 1. 2, there's an assumption that private capital markets with public policy nudges are going to get the job done. I think we have 30 years of data that shows us that that is not true. Third, there's been an assertion that the problem is an engineering problem. I actually agree with that in a way, but the engineering problem is subsidiary to fundamentally a political problem. How do you mobilize public resources sufficient to, and fast enough to do this in the face of opposition from fossil fuel interests? It's a political economy problem, not an engineering problem. And finally, that just transition, which has been mentioned here, I think is generally treated as a kind of charity act, but it's not. It's the only path to action, meaning that without a program for just transition, the politics are impossible. So I would ask the panel to react to those 4 propositions.
That's a powerful set of challenges on which to end up. And it reminds me, we do need a drink very soon because they are a challenge. And let's give this in reverse order. Patrick, over to you. Do you want to comment both on the original, the online questions about the UK, but also that phone, well, whatever takes your...
Yeah. Okay, so the first one was about the arrangements, UK arrangements for delivery. And I think that's a really important question because this is a lot about delivery. And to pick up on the last point, delivery is only possible with political will because there needs to be a huge marshalling of activities across all sorts of different areas. What we did as the Council of Science and Technology write a letter to the Prime Minister, I think 3 years ago now, saying that there needs to be a systems approach to this. This cannot be individual things being done one at a time. There needs to be an integrated approach to this as an entire systems problem. And therefore, government needs a systems map at the center, which is a living map, which you can actually monitor against with clear dashboard against various parts, which influence competing activities when you action them. And that there needs to be a knowledgeable expert group at the center of government that's actually doing this. In other words, it's not a generic problem, it's actually a rather technical, real problem that people need to understand the implications. So that was the recommendation, one of the recommendations we made, amongst others, which would of course include everything from finance through to engineering, through to behavior, through to all the other things that have been mentioned. So I do think that if this is going to be such an important part of what governments do, and indeed if you're going to make it a process which isn't just thought of in terms of cost, but actually is thought of in terms of both benefit for all sorts of parts of society in the country, but also, frankly, also potentially economic benefit, because you end up with export opportunities as well. This needs to be taken very seriously as a delivery problem with the right structure based around it. And we're not there yet, for sure. So I think that's an urgent need. And that leads on to the second question, which is, what's this government going to do? I don't know what this government's going to do, but I do know there's one thing going on at the moment, which I think is an important part of this, which is Chris Skidmore, who was a previous science minister, has been asked to review what would it take to implement net zero and do it, if anything, faster and with a economic benefit, or at least minimal economic cost to it. Now, that's a good question, and I don't know where that review is going to end up, but I think if you put those things together, it does mean that, assuming that review comes up with a series of concrete proposals to how you do this, it's going to require a delivery mechanism. Now, government can't deliver the whole thing, but government has got several levers it could pull in order to make this happen, which speaks to the political economy side of this. And in order to make it happen, that's where engineering, I think, is important. And I'm not an engineer, but I absolutely believe that systems engineering is an important part of making this happen. And I think that if you think about this in engineering terms, the biggest unknown in your model is actually human behavior. And it's quite useful to understand what the biggest unknown is in your system. And therefore, that tells you that there's a whole load of things there that need to happen as well. So I think that, to me, speaks to the need for a process inside government to deliver against this. And as part of the research and innovation side of this, a research and innovation framework was published about 6 months ago, and we're pushing to get a research and innovation delivery plan. What actually needs to happen? What are the things that must be done in order to do this? And as I said, if you work back from 2050, you find that the things you've got to do have to be done now, not in 2040 or 2030. And so I hope that research and innovation delivery plan, coupled with the Skidmore review, will lay out something which we can look at and say, well, does that meet the need? And if not, what more is required? I'll leave Jim and maybe to comment on, is mitigation possible? I think it is. The question is to what degree. In other words, is it completely possible to get to nothing? No, it's not. Is it possible to reach 1.5? Well, maybe, but we've got to do an awful lot to do it. So I think, but Jim can comment on that more. And I think the points about private capital is exactly why government needs to intervene on this. It's not going to happen with a total free market, but there are things you could do. And I mentioned the challenge that Bill Gates has thrown down of a green premium. How do you get that? Because frankly, if you're talking about scaling, which is when cost does start to come down, the barrier to get to scaling is so huge that the cost is so enormous at the beginning that is going to cause a problem in terms of normal market behaviors. I'll stop there.
Yeah, no, and that does. And just sticking with that for one more moment, I mean, you could argue that government and incentives can work incrementally, but things like, and look, I'm not an expert on this, but say hydrogen, where you would need quite a big decision to make a significant change in the infrastructure. You can't just use a bit more hydrogen bit by bit. And thinking of previous FST discussions, we've said that that's where there seems to be barriers to significant change, pushing a button on deciding whether or not to make a massive change like that. Emma, over to you.
So on green finance, my background is finance. I sat on the government's green finance task force and made sure it wasn't just about clean energy, but brought the adaptation, resilience and nature piece into that. It's from the green strategy, which was then published, that the Green Finance Institute was born. And the green finance strategy talks about financing green, which is getting the money into the projects, into the businesses, and greening finance, which is where you're talking about the regulatory setup. And here, having chaired the environmental regulatory body, I'm very much of the view that you have to have environment, climate change regulators working in lockstep with economic regulators, working in lockstep with financial regulators, and bring that mandatory part into it as well. As far as how we get the story of investments into net zero, but also nature, we do need to have hubs of information where the economics are talked about. Certainly the Green Finance Institute on its website has a hive for nature-based solutions projects. And again, a lot of work's been done by DEFRA, the Environment Agency, the Green Finance Institute, to start building both the projects and the bankable projects that can deliver nature-based solutions, which will also deliver adaptation and resilience and net zero. So we need to get that information into the public domain and make sure that we're learning from each other so that we can do this, not just in the UK, but around the world and at pace and at scale. And I think there was so much in those questions. The education point. I know at COP26 there was a big emphasis on education. All the education ministers had a meeting. I don't know what is planned for COP27, but I know that also that those involved in education at different levels, and I think we have made progress on things like GCSEs in this country. I was educated at a United World College in Canada, and was an early, I took the International Baccalaureate decades ago as one of the early takers of that education diploma. The college in Canada is now developing for sixth formers, the last 2 years at school, a climate action leadership diploma, because it views climate change has to be embedded in every single subject. It's a pilot, but it needs, again, to scale and get around the world so that we're preparing the next generation for what they're going to be dealing with. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. And just to say, I was very struck by the difference in tone between the two final questioners, one of whom was very optimistic, as it were. There's a sweet spot there, and the other one who said it's not quite as sweet a spot as you think. It's all more difficult. Now, I mean, what I would say on the economic sweet spot, getting the economic conditions is necessary to move things forward, but it's not enough by itself, because there are many other barriers and institutional factors to picking up some of these measures that really need to be addressed, which I think gets to the points made by the final questioner. You know, we need to do things differently and move things on if it's going to happen. We've been very clear in IPCC that if you take the Paris targets, incremental change is not enough. You need to look at more fundamental changes. And I would particularly emphasize the role of planning and infrastructure development and getting the right infrastructure there, because the risk at the moment is that we are currently doing things that are locking in carbon for the future. And quite frankly, we should stop doing these things. And insulation and the built environment is one of these classic areas where we could do things very differently, both to meet adaptation needs and mitigation needs at the same time. And I think the final question also mentioned just transition. And I'm obviously going to be enthusiastic about that. But there's a very pragmatic reason why just transition is important, because we will not get the social acceptability around these big changes unless it is perceived that things are being done fairly and we're not exacerbating existing inequalities. It's absolutely essential. And that really, the final point, are the UK institutions fit for purpose? Of course, an IPCC person cannot comment on any individual country, but just to say it is important that we move beyond incremental change. And I think looking at infrastructure, long-term investments, and the conditions we are creating for the way we live 10, 20 years in the future is going to be really important to address.
Yes, and you're absolutely right about the challenge there. And I can remember in the energy package, which Rishi Sunak, as the then Chancellor, announced in the spring, which was entirely on helping with costs and bills. I did say to a senior Treasury official, I was very surprised that there'd be nothing in it on insulation or energy efficiency and she said, it was very revealing. She said, yeah, the trouble is we don't have skilled workers to go around helping on things like insulating houses. So we decided we hadn't got the capacity to do it. And so it had to be entirely a transfer payment, help with costs program. And that was so frustrating that was that's the education and skills challenge standing in the way of doing real stuff. Now, we are going to we're going to break for our reception in a moment, but it's been marvelous, Professor Sakr, that you have come here from Egypt when you are so busy preparing for COP27. So your final observations on the questions you've just heard, and more widely, any other advice you have for us, as you've got a predominantly British audience, obviously emerging from COP26, on what you'd most like to see us doing in the next month and at COP27.
Okay, thank you very much. Yeah, and in fact, during the last period when I came in direct contact with climate change issues and listen for the opinion of different peoples from different nations, from different background and so on. In my opinion, we are in their need for redesigning strategies to cope with climate change crisis in a changing world. Yes, we must support very much climate change research. We must actually work very hard to secure the previously allocated fund for Green Fund or the $110 billion for climate change research, but actually the situation on the floor is quite different, especially when it comes to developing and less developing countries. Now, I believe the time is to incentivize the local communities actually, and to have them on board together to combat climate change. Our experience in Egypt as a part of Africa is that it is possible really to post and to accelerate voluntary lowering of carbon dioxide emission in some sectors, like agriculture sectors, through incentives, through awareness, through education, through mindset transformation, using the available existing technology and innovation. Of course, we may need more innovations to support the adaptation and resilience effort. We may need a huge fund to re-innovate the infrastructure to be more resilient in many of the African countries, but the cornerstone is people themselves. Of course, we are in their policies, strategies, plan, and so on, but I believe too much on citizen-based science and community engagement and awareness and education. Education is a must. In Egypt also, we are trying now to actually prepare a curricula to be mainstreamed in all Egyptian universities to study in more details in a very simple way about the climate change crisis and the issue. So we have to have a public acceptance and engagement, because this is actually many challenges. Of course, in addition to the innovative and the technological and engineering solution as well. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. And thank you for joining us. Thank you to all four of our panelists. We will now adjourn for a reception. We will then go downstairs at 8 o'clock for dinner. And for those of you who've not yet had an opportunity to put your questions, we'll then try over dinner to have a continuation of this discussion, although sadly our online participation will now be coming to an end. Thank you all very much indeed.